Say hello and welcome to the show called The Truth Tribe. I'm your host, Ravi Toor, and today we'll be discussing not for profits, community work, leadership, women power, and what it means to be an immigrant in this beautiful country called Canada. With a very special guest, Executive Director from Mood Disorders Association of Manitoba, Rita Chahal. Ma'am, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure. Namaste. Sat Sri Akal. Good afternoon here in Manitoba. And bonjour. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, for those who don't know Rita Chahal, hold on to your seats because this impressive bio follows next. Rita Chahal currently serves as the Executive Director of the Mood Disorder Association of Manitoba. Traveling from Northern India to Pier 21 on Canada's East Coast at the age of 9, Rita Chahal and her family were the second East Indian family to settle in Prince Edward Island during the mid-60s. She later went on to graduate from Dalhousie University with honors and eventually settled in Manitoba. Building her career in the prairies for over 42 years, Rita's work spans academia and corporate sectors. However, most prominently, she has served for the not-for-profit sector for over 25 years. As a champion of change, Rita has held key leadership roles serving as Executive Director for the Women in Media Foundation, Employment Projects of Winnipeg, and the Manitoba Interfaith Immigration Council. Her vision and leadership played a key role in leading the province through the settlement of refugees during the Syrian refugee crisis and the influx of U.S. claimants during the Trump administration. As the general manager of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, Rita was the first person and women of color to take on the role. Major cornerstones of her initiatives addressed labor skill shortage issues, foreign trade, credential recognition, and HR services to address the impact of domestic violence in the workplace. Her community work includes serving on numerous local, provincial, and national committee and Crown Corporation boards as a chair or executive member. She has served on the Winnipeg United Way Poverty Council and is currently a member of the United Way Speakers Bureau. In 2021, the Nellie McClung Foundation named Rita as the inaugural recipient of the Manitoba 150 Women Trailblazer Award. The award salutes the contribution that Manitoba women have made to social justice, arts, sports, politics, community activities, and promoting democracy. In 2022, Rita was awarded the Top 25 Immigrants of Canada Award, an award which recognizes immigrants across Canada who have made a meaningful impact across the country. More recently, Rita was awarded a recipient of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Award. Super excited to have you here and to chat with you and to learn from you today. But to start us off, in your own words, who are you and what do you do?
First of all, I pity you for having to read all that information. But thank you for your generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And it gives you a moment to think about some of the work that I have had the privilege of working with many other people. I haven't done it alone. And so there's been many people in my life who have helped me support to be able to do some of the things that you identified. Who am I? First and foremost, I am a mother. And that is the most important part of my life. And now, of course, a grandmother of 4. So those two things, relationships take priority over everything else. Besides that, I'm definitely a loving daughter, a sister, hopefully a loving wife, and an aunt, and so on and so forth, too, and all the beautiful relationships that I have in my life. And I'm also a community advocate, and I do work closely with marginalized groups, and I've had the privilege and humbled by some of the circumstances and the opportunities that I've had to work with some of Canada's people right across the country. That's a little bit about who I am, but first and foremost, I'm a mom and a grandmother.
That's wonderful. So there's a few different points where we can start off this conversation. I thought to start it off at your childhood. And what I want to ask you is, when you look back at your childhood, what is your most favorite moment that comes to your mind? Who are you with? What are you doing? And how has that shaped your worldview?
That's a great question to start off with. My childhood, of course, as you said earlier, I arrived in Canada at the age of 9. Prior to that, perhaps some of the most precious moments in my life were in India before I left. And that was the close-knit relationship that I had with my Amma, which really who was my nanny. And I referred to her as Amma because everybody else in the family referred to her as Amma. She had, I think, a very profound impact on me just because she was a very strong woman. I didn't want to leave my Amma when I left India. And I carried that with me for many years. I always wanted to go back because that's who I wanted to be with. But I think also the upbringing that I had in the early schooling years that I had in India have continued to play a role in who I am today. I was very blessed to be born in a family where that came from very humble beginnings. However, my dad was one of India's best known athletes. He eventually went on to become one of the best in India. But he and Milka Singh were friends and they raced together. We have lots of stories in our family about Milka Singh and my dad racing together in many of the national tournaments. So my father was able to get a sports director position at a school called Bishop Cotton School in Shimla. It was a British school, and that's where a lot of my early molding and introduction to schooling and especially to English first happened. So a lot of how the school, um, looked after the children, looked after the students. I was what was called a day scholar, and because I was the daughter of a staff person, so I was allowed to, because it was an all boys school. It's called Bishop Cotton School, and there are several branches of it in India. But it was an all boys school, but the daughters of the staff were allowed to go there till what we in Canada would call grade 6, but it was upper 2. And based on the British system, that's what. So that helped mold a lot of my early sort of habits, my academic competitive nature in some ways, but also the humility that we were taught in that school, the need for service, the need for having spiritual guidance. Those are all things that were really, that helped shape my life, and I'm able to carry those forward. I always do say I am what I am because of the upbringing that I had in those early years at Bishop Cotton School. I say that to my mom a lot. My dad passed away 3 years ago during COVID, but but we last year were able to go to India and take to his final resting place. And he was an incredible man. I learned so much from him. I thank him for bringing us to Canada and giving us the life that we have now. And the bravery with which early people who came to Canada in those 50s and 60s, to be so brave to take your whole family and move to a new place and start all over again. And so very, those are the role models that we've had to grow up. And I've seen how they put all of their energies in ensuring that their children had the best possible.
Absolutely. Love that story there. So let's move on to your academic careers. What I found really interesting was your early years at the Dalhousie University. You were doing Bachelor of Science. What sparked your interest into science, and how was that? How were those initial days?
Why did I want to go into science? I'll tell you one thing, and I'm sure there's a few other of your listeners who can identify with that. Back in the day, back in the 60s, 70s, almost every East Indian family that came to Canada wanted their daughters and sons to be doctors. That was set for me, that you're going to be a doctor and you're going to follow a science path, which is what I did. I didn't quite make it to med school. I have to admit I was reasonably good at science. However, and admitting this on a national podcast, I failed chemistry. I failed organic chemistry. And for a variety of reasons, so I won't go into that. But you cannot get into med school without organic chemistry. So I got I still did apply because that was what I was supposed to do. And so the dean of Charles Tupper Medical School at Dalhousie University sent me a lovely letter, and that obviously I wasn't accepted, but I should look at other career options for myself. The science was great. I still have a good understanding of it. I did encourage all my children to follow that the route, and not that they did. But my life took a totally different turn, and here I am 40-some years later in the not-for-profit sector, heading a mental health organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems like it worked in your favor. And that also makes the two of us, because I love science, but chemistry is not my strong suit. I like physics and I like biology, but chemistry was the reason I didn't pursue it. So love that in there. Are there any habits that you formed in your university days that you still carry in your day-to-day? Any foundational habits that were formed in the university? that has helped you in your career?
Yes, I think there's a few things that have certainly learning how to time management was one big one. My mother always taught me make your bed first thing in the morning, and I still to this day and do that because people don't realize that is an important part starting your day. If you have that part of your day organized, the rest of your room looks great, and so I feel less disorganized. So that's one habit that I've continued. The other thing that I think a little bit more related to what we're talking about is the need to ensure that you surround yourself with people that can support you and that you can support them so that there's some common ground. So there's some, and I was very fortunate that I had an incredible group of friends at university and we still stay connected. And when when this is finished, I'm going to send them the link to this podcast and we still stay connected, all of us, but you could go to any one of them if you needed some help. And we did that for each other. So I think that's something that I continue to carry with me, that if I need help, I'm not afraid to ask for it. I'm not hesitant. Again, you have to weigh out what it is you're asking for. But overall, I think one should not be afraid to ask for help when you need it. And they say vulnerability is your greatest strength. If you can show some vulnerability, and I've had to, and many times, to do that.
So next, what I wanted to check with you is your role as the general manager for the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce. You were the first woman of color to be selected for that position. Being a woman in that position and then being a woman of color, what sort of responsibility was on your shoulders and how did you manage to deal with your workload?
First of all, it was a great privilege, I thought, to be invited to take on that role. I was recommended for the role, so it's not one that the job that I applied for. The CEO of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce connected with me and invited me to see if I would consider. So that was an important confidence builder for me to be invited. It was only later that I found out that I was the first woman. I was the first woman of color, and the first woman first individual actually at the chamber who had an arts and kind of a crazy not-for-profit mixed up background. So I always say kudos to the chamber, the Manitoba Chamber, for taking that huge leap of faith and believing in my ability to do the job. Because as many people will attest to this, is that the chamber over the years, it's definitely changed, but over the years has traditionally been a very male-dominated environment, a very corporate environment, even though the chambers themselves the associations are not-for-profits, but the clients that they serve are very much corporate. That in itself was a huge leap for them to be able to do that. And so one of the questions actually during my conversation that I had with the CEO at the time who invited me to take on the role, he said, this is sounding funny a little bit, how do you deal with very aggressive, bold men who are very demanding when asking the chamber for something? And I thought about it because often we would have to deal with a lot of men. And I said, very diplomatically. And he loved that response. And anyway, it wasn't because of that response that I got the job. I believe I got it because of what I brought to the table. Moving forward on that, the file that I was given was to work with our chambers in rural Manitoba. And that gave me some really great insight into what rural Canada was really like, what rural Manitoba certainly was. And it also allowed me to connect with and find out where some of the skill shortages were in our province. And at that time, and just prior to that, I had also had the privilege of being on a ministerial advisory committee that had looked at credential recognition in foreign trained professionals. So that allowed me to really put that experience and that learning and some of the gaps that existed in the workplace, especially in rural Manitoba, to be able to connect employers with that pool of qualified individuals that companies could help recruit. So there were some really great initiatives that we were working under. Again, the CEO of the organization was very supportive of my work. He went on to nominate me to be on the national executive as well for the chamber, representing Manitoba, of course. But also it gave me an opportunity to work with employers to hear about some of the other challenges that employers were experiencing in everyday in their company. So one of the initiatives that I did work on was the impact of the impact of domestic violence in the workplace. How can it impact productivity? How can it impact performance? Those kind of things. So I was heading a committee that allowed us to work with human resource professionals, the human resources managers, and to really it was a ministerial appointment. And so work with the minister's office, status of women, and the workplace, doing a lot of work and really educating workplaces on how they could deal with some of the because violence against women is very real. It doesn't just happen behind a closed door. It impacts your workplace. It impacts your children. It impacts their schooling. It impacts. There's a whole domino effect of the impact of domestic violence. So we were able to really help train some of those folks, and I know the work has continued at the chamber since I left. So I'm glad that I was able to be part of that inaugural piece of educating our corporate sector on that.
Just a quick question on that. If I have to ask you, I think you highlighted a couple of key points already, but on the economic forefront, what are some of the challenges that Manitoba as a province face right now?
I think Manitoba has actually been quite progressive in ways that they have dealt with some of their shortfall in terms of employment and filling that skill shortage. We have had one of the best nominee programs. We were one of the first, and so I was quite involved in that process as well. And that's where my contributions into credential recognition came in. I think we're like many others right now. Certainly, the economic things that are impacting our province are things like housing and just the lack of employees that can do the jobs that need to be done. So the skill shortage is still there. I think we should still we are continuing to look at the pool of new arrivals in Canada from across the country, as well as from overseas that can help fill those gaps. We're in the middle of an election, so I really can't talk too much about the election is in 1 week. There's lots of promises being made and things like that. But I think overall, Manitoba can come a long way, certainly in some of the things that I've been involved with, but we still have a long way to go. Mental health still continues to be a huge concern for all of us across the country. I'm right in the middle and thick of it right now. I think that's where a lot of investments have to be made. I've been privileged to be invited to the Minister's Advisory Council to provide input into how the provincial mental health strategies can be rolled out and how it needs to align with the communities. I'll certainly lend my voice as an individual, but also the voice of my sector and my organization and sister organizations that I work with to ensure that Manitobans get the services that they need to help them in their mental health journey of hope and recovery.
That's wonderful and quite interesting venture that you have taken on. It's interesting you mentioned the elections because I was doing a podcast interview yesterday and we were talking about the elections and my guest was actually waiting for the election results as well. So I'm sure all eyes are on that election results that come next week. So let's switch gears and move on to what your current role is as the executive director of the Mood Disorder Association of Manitoba. If you have to break down this organization, some of the key objectives and initiatives you guys have, what would that look like?
We've just finished a strategic plan. We've just implemented it. If you can think of a triangle in a person's life and to take it one step further and think about it, a triangle in a person who might be dealing with a mental health condition or diagnosis, there are really three aspects to how they can manage the diagnosis, and once they need to help themselves towards recovery. So the one of those one point of that triangle is definitely the professionals that they work with, whether it's the doctor, the therapist, the hospitals, the pharmacists, and all the professionals that help you take care of your diagnosis, whether it's prescribing a medication or seeing a psychiatrist, all of those pieces. The second piece is the family that supports you to be able to manage the professional direction and professional support that you need. making sure you get to your appointments, making sure you eat well, making sure you have a place to stay, and making sure you get your meds on time, those kinds of. So it's the family and the caregiver is very important. Without that, this part here wouldn't be able to do it. And then there's the third part, which is where organizations like Mood Disorders Association are part of that mental health support system. So we're a non-clinical organization. So we provide peer support, which means essentially, without going into some detailed definitions, basically it means that if you have lived or shared experience with a mental illness, then you can provide the peer support to others. And so it's an interaction between two people in a confidential, safe environment so that people can. Often what happens is people think, am I the only one who's experiencing this? And when you start getting peer support, you realize that others have had it too. And then something that they might have done can help you navigate your journey. Just something you might hear or somebody might share. You know what? I tried this and it worked for me. Or it might be a discussion about medication or support. So that's the third piece. So that's the role that we are playing. We are all across the province. So we have staff and offices in various jurisdictions. What role can we play? I think the fact that we see this on the ground. People right now, there's a real shortage of mental health professionals. So we have psychiatrists who are retiring or therapists who have decided to change careers or things like that. Lots of things happen post-COVID. And there's a huge gap in the demand and the services that are needed. When you can only go see your psychiatrist maybe every 2 months, we as an organization can help engage a weekly meeting, weekly support. You can come to us and work with us to help you get through to the next one. Like on many things, there are long waiting lists. For example, disordered eating is one area where that's huge, not just for women, but for men as well. But the waiting list for treatment for those programs is huge. And we provide a program called Disordered Eating. Eating disorders is the diagnosis, but we don't deal with the eating disorder. We work with disordered eating, which is quite different than a clinical diagnosis. So we can help provide that. Somebody who's waiting 3 years can still go to a peer support group and help themselves. Again, we will never prescribe. We will never tell you exactly what clinical interventions you need, but we can provide that peer support. I think that the peer support can often be a very strong tool and support system in your overall recovery and towards mental wellness. We always want to make sure that people stay in mental wellness as opposed to mental illness. We all have mental health, just like we have our physical health, but it's learning to manage that continuum from mental illness to mental wellness, which is where we help you come in with giving you strategies. We do the weekly one-on-one peer support, access to resources, whether to our website or on site. We go to communities and we share information through education, provide information sessions. I do a lot of presentations, as do many of my staff, to employers and to those who in schools and things like that. So again, it's that whole education and advocacy piece and the actual frontline services that we provide. Maybe a long answer to the question you asked, but I hope that helped.
It sure does. And I'm thinking of a couple of quick questions just on that note. So my first question is, when you're talking about this peer-to-peer support, the peer support that you are providing, is it a set group of folks do you have in there, or could it be anybody I can be a part of your network and then
you can anyone can join us if they need peer support. They're on, and in some cases, certain things there is a bit of a vetting process because if you're going to maybe the same number of people can go through a 6-week program or things like that. But generally, you can come as often or as little as you want. We're moving towards a more activity-based peer support model. You're painting or you're doing part of a book club or we have a program called MatKid for young people between the ages of 12 to 17. It's open. It's a service that we provide free during the summer for young people. The peer support, and of course, we a lot of our services are delivered through a volunteer base. We have a very strong volunteer base who also have sometimes been a client initially, and then, like me, they're able to then provide peer support to others because they've gone through the process themselves. But yes, you could join us, or if you know of any loved ones. And I know that from time to time we have taken people out of province as well, because now everything is virtual, right? You can log in from anywhere. But I would say majority of our clients are from Manitoba, and if services are being delivered in our Westman or region, for example, Brandon, most of the clients that will be joining those groups virtually or in person will be from that region.
Very interesting and very cool initiative, because I've had a chance to speak with a couple other mental health professionals during this podcast. And some of the challenges are exactly what you laid out there, is not having enough professionals and not getting that support within that time frame. And you have that big delay. So I think this model really comes in and fills in that gap.
Actually, I have to say that when COVID, no one was seeing people in person. So that the spread played a huge havoc on people's lives. They had nowhere to go. So like other organizations, I've been with the organization now for about 3 years. We, like others, had to, what the buzzword at the time was pivot. So we had to pivot to virtual delivery. But not everyone had access to the tools to go online. Not everyone has a smartphone or a computer, and of course, in rural regions, rural Manitoba, the infrastructure isn't necessary as the best. So there was that issue to deal with. So now that we provide a hybrid model, we have to make sure that not everyone was then comfortable come back to in person. We lost a lot of people. I think there was a huge concern on our part that people who were very marginalized to begin with and were dealing with mental health issues were now marginalized even further because they had no access to technology that was being implemented. The one silver, I guess there were perhaps others, but the one that I tend to refer most to, silver lining of the pandemic, was that the conversations about mental health, about mental illness, about mental wellness have become more commonplace. Mental health is still very much a stigmatized topic, but it's less so than it used to be. And especially in the ethnocultural communities, it's still very destigmatized. It's something that we still don't want to talk about. And so as an organization, we're working towards trying to get that message out, that it's okay to ask for help. There's nothing wrong with it. You're not any less than anyone else if you ask for help and support.
100%. And I think that's some wonderful work. And a lot of people can use that help. So kudos to you and the team for stepping in there and doing your work. If I have to ask you, just on that note, if you have the authority to make 3 changes in how the mental health services are delivered or how it is set up today, what would those 3 changes be and why?
Great question. I hope the politicians hear me on this response. I would certainly say that if I was in a position to make those changes, I would invest in training professionals. I think that's where one of the things that is lacking. So some organizations, especially like the province, don't necessarily always have the means, the financial means. They might have the will and they might even have the people, but they don't have the means to be able to invest in good training, long-lasting training. Because often what happens is they invest in the training, but then the individual leaves because they're now trained and have to get a better job. So the second point that would be attached to the training piece would to ensure that people are compensated. I think that in this sector, and in particular the not-for-profit sector, there needs to be a real hard look at how people are compensated. Our work is not any less important than our counterparts in the public or the corporate sector. So I think that's a conversation that has started, but it needs to continue and it needs to be addressed in a more constructive, more strategically and with some assurity that our legislative decision makers are listening. So I think that's where I would invest. And the third thing I think is in the mental health sector is to really to educate people that mental health is not something to be afraid of. the individual is in a very vulnerable stage. They need love and care and compassion more than anything, and support to get them through their journey of hope and recovery.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. My follow-up question on that, just what you said, is can you share an instance where you or your organization has helped a particular individual with whatever it was that they were struggling with? Sort of what was the situation? How did you guys help them? What was the outcome?
We help people every day. And I have to be very careful when I respond to that question because we absolutely adhere to confidentiality. Anyone who comes to
Yeah.
but there are times when we have had to talk somebody out of harming themselves, or where they might be on the verge of giving up. All of us are trained and as suicide prevention, we call assist. So that has happened many times. It happens often enough that we hear from the individual and says, if somebody hasn't answered that phone, I might not be here today. If so-and-so, referring to an individual, saying, Jane hadn't answered the phone, and Jane, if you hadn't talked with me, I'm just using Jane as an example, you hadn't answered the phone, I might have just walked off and done what I was thinking of. So that's one that we absolutely deal with. We have staff who end up going to the emergency hospital emergency room, holding someone's hand because they don't have a family member that they can call, and they might have harmed themselves with a drug overdose or with some other unfortunate incident. I can tell you, I can share my personal experience with you. How
Please,
I help.
if you're comfortable.
Yeah, I'm comfortable in sharing that. How I help myself and how mood disorders helped me. At the onset, this is taking some level of courage to do this at a national level. But I do share my story with others when I'm invited as a speaker to different things and presentations that I make. 3 years when the pandemic started, I, like many other Canadians, lost my job. It's a high-profile job, the senior leadership role. And we won't get into why or what happened and things like that because employers have to make certain decisions. But I'll talk about the impact that it had on me. So when it happened, I thought, oh my goodness. And I was at age 63. Now you can figure out how old I am. At age 63, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? And it was like the floor just, yeah. I thought, get my keys. That's position thingy. I said, I'll never be able to get back up again. I went home and my family obviously supported. But I crawled into bed and I thought I'm never going to get out. I'm just going to go away, let me wither away, and I'm never going to get out. I was lucky that I had a family member, my mother, sister, solid support kita. And for about 6 weeks, with pity on myself and Mickey currently. And I had a good friend in Halifax, one of my university friends, and she called me and she said, Rita, the pity party is over. Just get over it. And I thought, okay, that's what I have to do. And so I realized, and what had happened actually, if I can give you an image of what I experienced at the time, is in Manitoba, we get a lot of tornadoes and warnings and so cyclones. And if you can vision that there's a big opening at the beginning, at the top, and then the funnel goes down, right? And so what I felt like is I was being sucked into this funnel. And I was going to drown, and I'm never going to get out of this, and I don't even want to get out of it. But all I kept doing was I kept looking at, again, the visual that I can share with you, and I kept looking at this light that was at the top of this tunnel. And all I wanted to do was just hold on to that light and just keep me from actually, even though I might say I want to drown, but I really didn't want to drown. I somehow found the strength to build a support system for myself. And I was selective in my support system. I really thought about who I needed to have. There's about 5 or 6 really strong people that I kept around me. Obviously, my family aside. My mother and sister were a big part of my support system and the rest of my family. But I made sure I stayed connected to some former colleagues, to some other new people, I selected these people, and I had conversations with them, and I said, you need to check in on me every day or every other day. If you don't hear from me, it's time to figure out where I might be. And again, it wasn't just about doom and gloom that I had to check with them, but they checked in on me. They made sure I was okay, made sure I was eating, made sure all of the things that needed to be. But it also, what I did for myself was I said, okay, I have so much to give to people still. I'm not done yet. I made a routine for myself. I made sure I got up and I got ready for as if I was going to work. I would spend 3 hours in the morning and I would sit at my desk. My husband got me all set up with a computer on a workstation. And I would do job searches or whatever research I had to do. I made sure I took breaks in between. So at 10 o'clock or 10:30, I would go listen to the Prime Minister give his daily briefing on the COVID. I made sure I tried to eat reasonably healthy. Even if I didn't eat a lot, I had to work at trying to get myself to eat. So I made lunch or whatever. And then I also, in that, because we couldn't go anywhere, we were all stuck at home. I also wanted to do something for myself that not just work, but not just, be out on this hamster wheel looking for a job. I would watch Hallmark movies. This was my way of decompressing. I think I've watched every Hallmark movie, many of them made in Manitoba during this period. But they were very predictable, always had a happy ending. You got to see some nice things. And I tried to go for walks. I tried to learn how to exercise. I have a long way to do the exercise, but I haven't got right there, but I certainly tried. But I try to make sure that I built that support system for myself. But I also knew that because I needed to work. So instead of looking for work, I created my own work. I created my own company called Cluster Management, and I started doing some pro bono work for some not-for-profit organizations in our area that have for the years supported me. And so I started open my own company and started networking through that. And it was through that networking that I got the job at Mood Disorders. I got a small contract, actually. And so I said, okay, I'll give it my best. It was like a 15-hour-a-week contract. And eventually, within about 3 months, it turned into a full-time position. Mood disorders helped me get back on my feet. It saved me from drowning. As well as I have to be grateful to all of the people that were in my support system, especially the women that were in my support system were really great and looked after me. So here I am now in a position to help other people, other women. One of the things that I found when I found myself drowning was that there weren't a lot of support systems. In fact, there were none for women who had been in senior leadership roles. Because often when you are in senior leadership roles, you're expected to be the strength. You're supposed to carry on. And of course, it can be a very lonely place because you don't always you'll have to take the charge and the lead. So you don't have necessarily someone else to turn to, and you can't be vulnerable. You can't cry. You can't show you're making a decision, but you're really scared inside. Am I making the right? Second guessing yourself. So when all this happened to me, there were no support systems in place. So one of the things that I've done was, since coming on mood disorders, I've started a project that I work on called the Women's Speaker Series, where we invite women, and a lot of them are women in senior roles who have gone through their own journeys and are willing to talk about it. It's become a very successful project that we're working on. That's something that I'm very proud of that we're doing here. We've had people like Chantal Kraviazek share her story on our speaker series. We've had CEOs, but also ordinary, everyday women who are moms, who are homemakers, who are working and struggling with many things, but now are able to give hope to others. So our Women's Speaker Series is something that I'm quite proud of. We have a great women's program here, by the way, if anyone's interested.
That's lovely. And I thank you for sharing that story of yours. And that's part of why that's one of the main goals of this podcast is a lot of times you see the person outside and you see the strong force, but a lot of times it's all these stories in the background that have made you the person you are. So I absolutely love that. I love the fact that you have such a good support system in your friends who were there for you to just lend a ear. And I don't miss those 10:30 calls from Prime Minister Trudeau at all during those COVID hours. So a lot of good stuff. My question is, what would be your message to somebody else who's struggling with something like this? Since you've gone through this, what would you tell them?
First and foremost, you're not alone. You're absolutely not alone. 1 in 3 Canadians will experience some kind of a mental health challenge before the age of 40.
Mhm.
And those are pretty alarming statistics. And again, unfortunately didn't bring a lot of stats with me to share with you, but I can send you those if you want to put up as part of your transcript later on. I would tell people that don't be afraid to ask for help. It's nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, it is your greatest strength when you can show your vulnerability and say, "I need help." If you and I had a broken ankle or a heart condition, or we were diagnosed with something that we weren't expecting, would we not go to the doctor? Would we not ask for help? We would ask our friends. We would tell our friends. To some degree, we would share that with others. So if you're experiencing anything, that's the first step you can do, is to ask for help. And there are good resources out there. Maybe we need more, but there are, and there's people who can help navigate that process for you.
100%. And I usually bring stats on my program here, and I love to share stats. I don't have any in front of me either, but I validate what you just said about the mental health problem. 1 in 3, less than 40 years old. I know the suicides in Canada, the suicide rate is really high. It's about 4,000 suicides a year, every year for the last few years, right? These are some real concerns, and I appreciate you just talking openly about these. Just to flip the switch on it and talk about some high moments and proud moments, what would you categorize as your most proud moment in your career so far, and what did that teach you?
But you're asking about career, certainly been lots of really high points in my both personal and professional life, but referring back to my professional life, one of the, I can summarize the highlight in a way, was when we did have people coming to our country that we had to open our hearts and our homes to during the Syrian refugee crisis initiative that Canada led. Was certainly one of those highlights where I was very much at the kind of leadership role, being able to provide that. But I think equally important with that one was, and this was very much a political issue, so I won't get into the politics of the circumstances, but when south of the border, we had the president of the U.S. make some changes to their immigration policies, and people came across borders at Manitoba. But people were traveling at night in -40 temperatures with children and backpacks and for hours on end. And the world attention was on Manitoba. And I had to put on a hat that could, and then sometimes did become very politically volatile. I could not, and again, because I work for a not-for-profit, we had to worry about funding and things like that, and of course the political messaging that the country had to deal with. I had to put on a very caring and compassionate hat, and I had to say that out loud and say, I'm not going to talk about the politics of any country or the decisions of any particular leader. What we're doing and the way we're supporting those who are coming to our province was really just on a humanitarian basis. We were not seeing numbers. We were seeing the faces of the people who came. We were seeing the faces of the children. We needed to make sure that nobody lost their life in these crossings at midnight and at -40. We needed to make sure that they had shelter and food, and then allowed themselves to just think and take the next steps. So I took some really strong decisions at the time, not necessarily the most popular decisions at the time. Very, as I said, very politically, and I won't get into the politics. But the world was on here. We were on the world stage, so the world media descended on in Winnipeg. I had to handle it there were times when there would be 5 or 6 broadcasters waiting in our lobby wanting to interview me about the situation. And I became quite good at it, actually, to be able to keep the politics out of it and really put a very human face to what was happening. And I remember being on one of the radio, NPR in the US invited me to do an interview and asked me lots of questions. And one of the questions my response to the question, I don't even remember the question, but my response to the question was that we really need to treat people with dignity and respect, which was an underlying thing that's not something I had to think about. And just that phrase, that saying we need to treat dignity and respect, if we use treat people with dignity and respect, became so powerful that the next day I was flooded with requests from the US, from South America, from Europe, asking me to talk about that need for. They said no one talks about that anymore, about treating people with dignity and respect. And I thought that should be a basic human right. And managing that medium was a big highlight in my life when I was on CNN and every broadcaster in the US and every Canadian broadcaster, European, even India, the broadcast reached India, and I would get phone calls from India, people asking me if I can help them come to India. And I said, please, stay where you are. I do not advise you to go crossing at -40 and but ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਪੈਸੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲੈ ਨਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਪਰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਮੰਗਵਾ. That's what people were thinking. Honestly, it was because of the name recognition. Last name Chahal, people saw it in the papers or they saw it on television or whatever. And my assistant at the time, she started then to screen the calls because she, anyone were calling that she would put them through. But yeah, that was the kind of impact. So that was a proud moment for me in the sense that I really took my personal values and was able to not politicize it, but really treated people with dignity and respect. And that's something that has always been part of who I am. And I hope that was a message that I gave to others.
That's lovely. And what a beautiful story. And I don't think we do that enough these days, is treating everybody with dignity and respect. We are still fortunate that we live in a country like Canada. There's other countries that it's a far off path for some of those folks. So absolutely love that. And again, kudos to you for doing such great work.
I didn't do it alone. I had an incredible team that I worked with, people who were driving back and forth, and the generosity of Manitoban that came through at that time was something to behold. People were so generous with their offers of help and financially and food and all sorts of things. And with the generosity of the people, that's really moved me so much.
That's lovely. Shout out to all the Manitobans who did participate in it. So question on that, how do you, because you're so involved in the not-for-profit sector and there's so many initiatives you have worked on, how do you decide what societal issues to advocate for? Do you have a framework or how you go about making that decision as to what needs attention and what does not?
There's a lot of things that need attention in everyday life. It is sometimes a difficult decision. Sometimes even within an organization, you have to prioritize what are your organizational priorities and where do you focus. We all have limited budgets, and so we have to. Being in the not-for-profit, I have certainly worked with a lot of boards overall. And so I've been on both sides of the table. I've been a board member and in a leadership role as a board chair. I've also been in the role of the executive director, answering to a board. What I've learned and the way I handle it is that ultimately in the not-for-profit world, when you are board-led, it is the board who is your ultimate decision maker. You report that the board is responsible. Sometimes you agree to disagree with your board, but because you're reporting to them, you have to fulfill what their directive is. I've been very privileged to have worked with boards that have been given me a lot of autonomy. For example, the board that I've worked with when I made some of those difficult decisions when people were coming across the border, As I said, I've been very privileged to have had that. Thanks the boards to have what trusted me to make those right decisions. But there are times when we disagreed. How do I, as a person, my life has led me to always work with vulnerable populations, and so that always becomes an automatic way, whether it's working with women or with Indigenous communities, or whether it's youth, or whether it's now people dealing with mental health. Just my work has led me to work with vulnerable populations.
Let's go back in time and talk about your initial upbringing. There is a beautiful Canada connection that you have even before you came to Canada. I want to just hear that from you. What was it growing up in India, and then how were your initial days coming into Canada?
My Canadian connection started long before I came to Canada. In fact, it started when I was born at Maple Leaf Hospital in northern India, a small place called Kangra, which is close to Dharamsala, where the Jalai Lama lives. It's about 27 kilometers from there. I was born in Maple Leaf Hospital. I was delivered by a Canadian doctor, Dr. Haslam, from Southern Ontario, who was a missionary there. And my parents were married by a Canadian missionary, originally from Newfoundland, Dr. Dunstan. And he was, in fact, ended up being the headmaster of the school that I eventually went to in Shimla, Dr. Dunstan. And that was very much my earliest Canadian connection. As I told you, my parents came from humble beginnings, but my dad did achieve a lot of academic and success in his life, and he went on to being one of India's top athletes, Olympic caliber athlete. But the story that why he came to Canada is quite unique. I don't know if we have time to share that, but I'll try to summarize it. That there was a missionary who knew my father and was coming to Canada when she was leaving. But when my father, as I told you, had humble beginnings, he had been adopted by a woman in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, who came from a family that supported children all around the world. And she had seen a picture of my father in a church magazine. And she had no children of her own, was widowed. Elaine Champion was her name. And so she would support children's education, these children all around the world. But her only criterion was that the children must never find out who supported them through their school. So the story was written about my dad, about his athletic abilities, and how that he was a very talented, but didn't necessarily have the means to be able to go on to higher education and to an athletic career. So she chose him. And so she connected with the missionaries in India and sponsored my father. And he never knew what happened. And he just continued to go to school and one thing after another. And he was very successful in his academic and his sports career. Ran races with the likes of Milka Sehgal, and he were very good friends. It was Milka, Mushtaq, and Makhan. There were three of them that used to race together all the time. And one day, when this missionary came to Prince Edward Island, she was sitting in Elaine Champion's living room. And Elaine Champion asked her, she said, many years ago, I had supported a young man by such and such name, by the name Mushtaq Nathig. But for a while, I was getting information about him, but I don't know what happened to him. And her guest just about fell off her chair, apparently, and said, my last meal in India was at his home. And she went on and told my success of my life. And if she had, in fact, had her last meal in India at my parents' home in Shimla, that she had come to the school. And Granny Champion, we lovingly called her Granny Champion, because that's what she became to us. She was long gone now. Decided to break her silence and wrote to the headmaster of the school, who had made all these arrangements for my dad, that I need to connect with him. And so she wrote a letter to my father. Actually, no, she wrote a letter to my father, not to the headmaster. Excuse me. Explaining what had happened. And my father and read this letter. I still remember when this letter came. I was about 8, 9 years old. And he took the letter to Dr. Dustin, and he said, "What is this? Can you explain this to me?" And Dr. Dustin said, "Yes, this is true. This is the woman who helped support you in your days at school and through university and you looked." And so my father made a vow that he was going to take his, we obviously connected with the Australian champion, went back and forth, and he made it his mission to come and meet this woman who had done so much for his life to get him to where he was. And so in 1966, December 1966, we landed in Prince Edward Island. And actually, we landed at Pier 21 in Halifax just a few days before Christmas, and went on to go celebrate Christmas with Granny Champion. It was history after that. My father was very fortunate. He was well-educated, teacher, and so he had several job offers, and so he was able to get work, and one of the highest paid the teachers in Prince Edward Island at the time. Those kinds of things don't happen now, but back then it did. He also went on to receive the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame for bringing, introducing boxing. The boxing in Prince Edward Island. He introduced field hockey to Prince Edward Island, and he was very involved in the initial setup of the Canadian Games, the Canada Games. But from what I learned from my father was the importance of giving back to community, and both him and my mother, they worked really hard to give us a good life, and but also supported us to do what we wanted to in the end, do what we did, where I ended up in not-for-profit instead of being a doctor. And last year we took our dad home. He had passed away in 2020 due to COVID, but we couldn't take him to his final resting place because of travel restrictions. So we made arrangements with the church, and we were able to put him in his final resting place next to the school, literally. Like the school that he went to was really close to the church that we belonged to. And so one of the earliest principals of that school and he are very close to each other. Life really did come full circle for my dad, and he helped us
incredible.
Get where we are today. He would be so proud and happy that I'm able to share that story with the rest of the country.
I'm glad you shared that story because that's such an incredible story. And it's his hard work and his dedication that is now reflecting in everything that you are doing, right? It's like a snowball effect. You do good and then the good passes on through generations.
Yeah. My parents sponsored in those very early stages. They sponsored about 12 families, a very similar manner that Granny Champion sponsored us and we sponsored others. And then those families have gone on to sponsor others. So now there's a whole community that's settled in Canada, US, England, from those early sponsorships that my mother and father made. And he would pay for their fare, but he would pay him back, obviously. But yeah, there was a lot of support. And he was his own little settlement agency, helping people get settled when they first arrived in Prince Edward Island or in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. Many of them settled in these.
My next question to you is along the same line. So having all the experience you have gained so far and learning so much, doing so much, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self and why?
Actually, I was pretty bold when I was a 20-year-old. I was a bit of a rebel in many ways. So I would give myself advice as to continue honoring your heritage, to continue honoring where you came from. I've always been very close to my background. But what I've done with it is that I've really, working with the next generation, is really help recognize the importance of a bicultural heritage. That you really need to, Canada is home now. This is where I live. This is where I was raised. This is where I went to school. This is the country that has given me so much. And now my children have an opportunity to give back as well. So I tell people, if I can share with going back to my 20-year-old, is really be proud of that bicultural heritage. And I think I did do that, and I would give myself that same advice again. But I also give it to others. Don't forget where you came from. Be grounded in who you are and where you're at, and prepare for where you need to be.
That's a great advice, and I'm sure we all can learn from it and take it to heart and implement it in our lives. When you're not working or when you're not busy, how do you refresh yourself or stay mentally fit? What are some things that you do aside from work that keeps you on your A game?
I don't exercise enough. That's something I need to do. I do listen to music and I love dancing. Sometimes I dance along when I go to parties and socialize. But I, I try to do something mindless. Like I watch Indian serials from at the time that I follow it. But I also try to learn from some of those things too. Like even the Hallmark movies or even some of the current serials that I'm watching. I try to see if there's something that I can apply to myself. It might be just a poem or a saying. I try to see if I can get some out. But yeah, I'm getting to the stage where I really need to. I am slowing down a bit. I'm not all on the hamster wheel all the time. So I'm trying to learn to be a bit more relaxed. I try to spend more time talking to my grandchildren more than my children. They are the love of my life. And just as often as I can go visit them, I try to do that. So having conversations with them is important.
My next question is around the books. I find books add a lot of value to one's life. Reading does. If I have to ask you, what is your most favorite book or a book that you would recommend everyone reading? What would that be?
It's an old classic. I love Wuthering Heights. Oh, I did that. It's one of my books that I had to read in university. It still remains one of my favorites. And just I think
And who is that by? Veteran Heights?
Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights.
Okay.
And a couple of books that my dad always wanted, Power of Positive Thinking. So it's another one that I've read that's I've read back in my life. From time to time, when I feel the need for some spiritual guidance, I do read the Bible. So that's important. That's an important book that's always on my bedside. But yeah, I don't read as much as I'd like to, but certainly more recently I've started to read more books on mental health. Yeah. We have a book club here, child disorders. So some of the books I have started to read a few of them, but I'll get through them slowly. Some of the ones that are being read in our book club.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing the ones that you like. If you could put anything on a billboard for the entire Manitoba, or let's say the entire Canada to see, what would that message be and why?
I guess when I've said earlier that your vulnerability is your greatest strength. It's show up and show your vulnerability, and that's that's courage.
That's perfect. Amen to that. If I have to ask you, what does the future hold for you? What do you have in the works over the next couple of years? What does that look like?
Well, certainly I've already given you some hints as to the fact that I'm nearing retirement, but not quite ready for it. I will continue to work my business of cluster management to continue because that's something I can control a little bit better. And people are asking me to provide that the support to that. I do get invited to speak and hope I can continue to do that. I have been working on a book called From Himalayas to Halifax and Beyond. I've written the first 5 chapters. I have to finish at least the next few and get someone to publish it. It's still a book I started to work on when I was taking a course. Just really seeing the world when I can. And but my grandchildren is what I look most looking forward to is spending time with them and reliving some of the joys of watching children grow into the beautiful people that they turn out. I'm very blessed with kids, 3 beautiful kids who have done well for themselves and are now passing it forward.
That's excellent. I look forward to when that book is finished because I will be the first one to get that. It's been lovely talking to you and just learning from you and learning how your journey has been. And I'm hoping that anyone who is listening will be able to take some actionable bits into it and then implement into their own lives to make for a better life for themselves. Before I let you go, though, what would be your message to anyone who's listening, especially like the South Asian community, the immigrants coming to this country? We have more of them coming than ever before. Being an immigrant yourself, what is your message to them as to how to take this journey and what to expect?
I think that, I love Canada. We're so grateful that we have the opportunities that we have here. And so not to take that for granted, but to really approach things. What can I give back if I'm also taking? So that's something I like to think about all the time. Most of us, in general in life, we want to take, but we also need to give back as well. And again, something I said earlier, don't forget where you came from. Be grounded in who you are and know where you are and plan for the future where you want to be. And don't be afraid to ask for help. There is help out there if you need it. And those would be the things that I message that I would give to others.
That's awesome. Once again, it was lovely chatting with you just to learn from you. Thank you once again for your time.
Lovely to talk with you. My pleasure. I hope we talk again. And I want to say thank you to you and to your